Today on the Daily Dose, the Greensboro Four makes civil rights history. When four black college students refused to vacate a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, the civil rights sit-in movement of 1960 would spread across the South like wildfire, elevating the civil rights movement to a new level of national awareness. Influenced heavily by Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent protest philosophy, Ethel Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil refused to vacate a Woolworth lunch counter after they were refused service for the color of their skin. All four were students from the nearby North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, while their activist agenda was further inspired by the Freedom Riders, who tested the clout of the Supreme Court's recent decision banning segregation on interstate bus travel. Other underlying motivation came from the brutal 1955 murder of Emmett Till, who had allegedly whistled at a white woman in a Mississippi store. Assisted by local white businessman Ralph Jones, on February 1, 1960, the four students sat down at the lunch counter at Woolworth's, where the official policy was to refuse service to anyone but whites. When the four young men refused to leave, police were called to the scene, but were unable to take any action due to the complete lack of provocation on the part of the four students. By that time, Johns had alerted local media, who arrived in full force to cover the events on television. The four stayed until the store closed for the night, returning the next day with more student activists from other local colleges. By February 5th, some 300 students had joined the protest at Woolworth's, paralyzing the lunch counter and other downtown businesses. Heavy television coverage of the Greensboro sit-ins sparked a sit-in movement that spread rapidly to college towns throughout the South and then up into the North, as young blacks and whites joined in various forms of peaceful protest against segregationist policies, including libraries, beaches, hotels, and other whites-only establishments. While white pushback was frequently contentious, by the end of March, the movement had spread to 55 cities in 13 states, forcing previously segregated enterprises to quietly integrate by the summer of 1960. Today, the former Greensboro Woolworths, where the first sit-in took place, now houses the International Civil Rights Center and Museum, which features a restored version of the lunch counter where the Greensboro Four first sat, while part of the original lunch counter is now on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Today in the Daily Dose, the Immigration Act of 1965. In a nation populated mainly by periodic waves of foreign immigration, since its early inception, generations of American legislators have challenged and oftentimes limited certain ethnic populations seeking entry into the United States, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Other limiting bills included the Immigration Act of 1917, which established literacy requirements for immigrants arriving from Asia, and the Immigration Act of 1924, which banned Asian immigration entirely, while setting quotas on the number of immigrants allowed in from Eastern and Southern European nations. The later spawned by a xenophobic and quite racist belief that immigrants from these regions were simply too foreign for America. That all ended during the 1960s, when the 89th U.S. Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, so named for the legislators who helped move the bill through both houses of Congress. Signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson on December 1, 1965, the bill overturned the system of quotas set forth in the Immigration Act of 1924, which in turn opened up a new stream of inbound migration, primarily from Asia and Latin America, effectively altering the character and melting pot complexion of American immigration history.
Repeat after me. I hereby declare on oath that I renounce all allegiance and fidelity.
Combined with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act created a triumvirate of legislation spawned by the Civil Rights Movement, establishing a conscious attempt by American politicians to remove racial and national criteria from all aspects of American law. According to the Pew Research Center, in 1960, 84% of U.S. immigrants were born in Canada or Europe, while 9.5% came from Latin America and 3.8% from Asia. In 2017, by contrast, 13.2% came from Canada or Europe, 50.4% from Latin America, and 27.4% from Asia, making the Immigration Act of 1965 an equalization milestone for immigrants in search of a better life. Today in the Daily Dose, the Little Rock Nine.
What about you, sir? Do you think the colored students will show up?
If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up. Well, I think it's a breaking point of the school integration. I just don't feel that they have a right to go to school.
While racism remains an issue in America even to this day, it's important to note and comprehend that forward progress, particularly in the Jim Crow South of the 1950s, was the result of individuals who stood up for their constitutional rights, pushing through divisive barriers established by angry segregationists. In September of 1957, 9 black schoolchildren, the eldest only 17, stood up to angry backlash during a time of public school integration, seeking a better education for themselves while pursuing the American dream previously set aside for whites only in the segregated South.
This is Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. Troops, which for nearly 3 weeks lined the sidewalk here in front of the high school under orders to keep the colored students out, have been replaced now. And their orders to comply with the law, which means let the Negro students in if they come in.
They were Thelma Mothershed, Minnie Jean Brown, Jefferson Thomas, Terrence Roberts, Carlotta Walls, Gloria Ray, Ernest Green, Elizabeth Eckford, and Melba Patillo, known collectively as the Little Rock Nine. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling on Brown v. Board of Education found segregation of schools unconstitutional, but as the Little Rock Nine approached their newly integrated high school in Little Rock, segregationists stormed the campus in protest.
They got no business out here. This is our school, not theirs. They are their own.
As the violence escalated, Elizabeth Eckford was heckled by an angry mob who yelled, lynch her," as she walked calmly toward the entrance to the school. President Dwight D. Eisenhower soon intervened, setting a precedent for the nation as a whole.
Extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights in a climate permitting their free and fair exercise.
On September 25, 1957, the 101st Airborne Division and 10,000 National Guard troops escorted the Little Rock Nine as they walked bravely past screaming mobs of segregationist haters, boldly making their way into the classrooms of Little Rock Central High School.
You feel it's worth it going through this?
Yes, I do.
These 9 heroes were willing to step forward in the name of racial equality, not to mention a head-down chipping away at the oppression's pandemic in the Jim Crow South. Today in the Daily Dose, the Memphis sanitation strike. Working long hours in every kind of weather, all for a lowly 65 cents an hour, or $5.62 in today's currency, when 2 Memphis sanitation workers were crushed to death by a faulty garbage truck compactor. 1,300 Memphis sanitation workers walked off their jobs when city officials refused to provide compensation to the deceased workers' families. On February 23, 1968, after Memphis Mayor Henry Loeb refused all concessions to the striking workers, police assaulted peaceful protesters with tear gas, prompting Nashville professor and civil rights activist Reverend James Lawson to call on his friend Martin Luther King Jr. with the hope of drawing attention to the strikers' plight. Building on MLK's Poor People's Campaign, which advocated for underprivileged Americans, on March 18th of that same year, King addressed a crowd of some 25,000 people about the dignity of labor by saying, "Whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity, and it is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and it has worth." 10 days later, King returned to Memphis for another I Am a Man protest, which led to the death of an African-American teenager when an outside group infiltrated the Sanitation Workers' March. King would return to Memphis on April 3rd, delivering his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, which proved to be a tragic foreshadowing of his assassination the following day.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
While MLK's assassination sunk a nation into deep mourning and widespread civil unrest in major American cities, it also overshadowed the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, prompting King's still grieving widow, Coretta Scott King, to return to Memphis to spotlight the cause of underpaid sanitation workers. Following Coretta's act of courageous solidarity, President Lyndon Baines Johnson sent his Undersecretary of Labor to Memphis to help mediate an equitable agreement. 2 weeks later, Memphis leaders officially recognized the workers' union while granting generous pay raises for its members, making the Memphis sanitation strike a bittersweet milestone during the heated years of the civil rights movement. Today in the Daily Dose, the Opelousas Massacre. During the peak years of post-Civil War Reconstruction, in 1868, the Republican-majority Louisiana State Legislature ratified a new constitution, coattailing the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution by granting citizenship rights to recently emancipated African Americans, leading white carpetbaggers like 18-year-old Ohio teacher Emerson Bentley to help blacks in Opelousas, Louisiana, achieve economic, political, and educational parity with whites. Unwilling to cede power to newly freed African Americans, white Democrats in St. Landry Parish, the most populous parish in the state, pushed back against Republican-led Reconstruction efforts by joining hate groups like the Knights of the White Camellia, the Innocents, the Seymour Knights, and the Ku Klux Klan. As white vigilante groups inflicted violence against blacks and white Republicans, on September 13, 1868, Republicans held a meeting in Washington, Louisiana, not far from Opelousas, which soon turned into an angry face-off with armed Seymour Knights. A misfired rifle elevated tensions to near riot conditions, only to de-escalate when Bentley agreed to publish an honest accounting of events in the city's leading Republican newspaper, the St. Landry Progress. Instead, Bentley's published testimony of Republican intimidation by white Democrats furthered the wrath of white hate groups, leading to an outbreak of violence on September 28th, after rumors of an armed black uprising brought back generational fears of mass slave revolts against white slaveholders. With black lives no longer valued as slaves, on the first night of violence, 29 African American men were taken to a local prison, leading to the summary execution of 27 men without due process or trial. Unremitting bloodshed continued over the next 2 weeks, witnessing the deaths of African Americans in their homes or on the streets of Opelousas, including the public murder of C.E. Durand, the white editor-in-chief of the St. Landry Progress. By the time the violence ended, more than 250 people, the vast majority African American, were dead, effectively reversing Reconstruction-era gains for freed blacks in Louisiana. During the city's 2 weeks of racial homicide, all Republican-leaning newspapers were burned to the ground, and while Republican presidential candidate Ulysses S. Grant handily won the White House that same year, not a single Republican vote was counted in St. Landry Parish, making the Opelousas Massacre of 1868 yet another stain on America's slow embrace of equal rights. Today in the Daily Dose, the Rosewood Massacre. Originally settled in 1845 by both black and white Americans alike, African Americans in Rosewood, Florida, would suffer the same black codes and Jim Crow segregation laws as any other post-Civil War blacks in the southern U.S. After most whites in Rosewood moved to nearby Sumner by the 1890s, on New Year's Day 1923, 22-year-old Fannie Taylor claimed she was assaulted in her home by a black man, and when Sheriff Walker did little to find the perpetrator, Fannie's outraged husband gathered a white mob to hunt down the suspect. In response, white haters from Gainesville, including about 500 Ku Klux Klan members, descended on Rosewood, where law enforcement told them that a black prisoner named Jesse Hunter had escaped a chain gang, which set the mob in search of the missing prisoner. Convinced that Jesse Hunter was being hidden by Rosewood blacks, they forced Aaron Carrier out of his house, dragged him to Sumner behind a car, where he was cut loose and beaten to only inches of his life. When blacksmith Sam Carter confessed under duress that he had hidden the prisoner in some nearby woods, the mob shot him and hung him from a tree when he failed to produce the convict. After Sarah Carrier hid some 25 frightened black children in her house, she and her son were killed by white racists, which later set the mob to destroying Rosewood one home and business at a time. As the town burned to the ground, many surviving blacks hid themselves over the next few days in nearby swamps until Sarah Carrier's surviving son James led them to safety. For his alleged interference in helping his frightened brethren, the last of the white mob forced the Good Samaritan to dig his own grave before they murdered him. After Florida Governor Cary Hardy offered to send in the National Guard to restore order, Sheriff Walker declined the help, and while the white haters began to disperse, a group returned on January 7th to burn what little remained of the town. A special prosecutor and grand jury were appointed by Hardy to investigate, but after some 30 mostly white witnesses had testified, the jury was released after the prosecutor failed to find enough evidence for criminal prosecution. The surviving African Americans of Rosewood never returned after the killing spree and the destruction of their homes and businesses, making the Rosewood Massacre yet another stain in the South's long history of racial injustice. Today in the Daily Dose, the Scottsboro Boys. During the darkest days of the Great Depression, desperate men and women hitched rides on freight trains in search of work. And when a fight broke out on a freight train in 1931 Scottsboro, Alabama, police arrested 9 black teenagers after 2 white women accused the boys of raping them on the train. In a case mired in the Jim Crow South, when news got out about the 9 accused teenagers, an angry white mob descended upon the Scottsboro jail, prompting a local sheriff to call in the Alabama National Guard over fears of an impending lynching. In April of that same year, an all-white, all-male jury returned lightning-fast guilty verdicts for what became known as the Scottsboro Boys, handing down the death penalty to 8 while 13-year-old Leroy Wright's trial resulted in a hung jury when one jurist favored a lesser sentence of life in prison. As news of the shaky convictions spread around the world, the boy's fate became a rallying cry for the International Labor Defense, the legal wing of the American Communist Party, leading to international demonstrations against Southern-style racism. And after the Alabama Supreme Court upheld the convictions of 7 defendants, in March of 1932, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Powell v. Alabama that the boy's rights to due process under the 14th Amendment had been violated. After avowed rape victim Ruby Bates recanted much of her original testimony, the Scottsboro boys continued their legal appeals through the Alabama court system, leading to a second trip to the U.S. Supreme Court in January of 1935, when the court again overturned the guilty verdicts in Norris v. Alabama, citing the systematic exclusion of blacks from Alabama juries, a landmark decision which helped to integrate future juries across the United States. Despite clear evidence regarding the boy's innocence, the recurring trials brought international condemnation of the South's racist bias against blacks, inspiring numerous books, songs, films, and stage plays about the boy's unjust imprisonment, including a clear link to Harper Lee's classic novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, making the Scottsboro boys an early ignition point in the civil rights movement to come. Today on the Daily Dose, hatred and healing at the Burwood Wall. While many Detroit white men were off fighting World War I, African Americans migrated from northern and southern cities to fill the labor vacuum. But when white veterans returned home after the war, racial tensions began to rise over both jobs and housing, which only intensified during the lean years of the Great Depression. In 1941, attempting to respond to the housing shortage, a real estate developer in northwest Detroit faced a dilemma when he set out to build an all-white housing subdivision that butted up against a mostly African American neighborhood. When his bank turned down his construction loan application due to the potential for racial tension, he built the now infamous Burwood Wall as a physical separation between the two communities. Known as the Burwood Wall or Detroit's Wailing Wall, the half-mile structure covers 3 city blocks for the sole purpose of racial segregation. The wall begins across the street from the northern boundary of Van Antwerp Park on Pembroke Avenue between Burwood and Mundata Streets, extending north until just shy of 8 Mile Road. An exposed stretch of wall with no homes to the east runs through Alfonso Wells Memorial Playground between Chippewa Avenue and Norfolk Street. The Burwood Wall stands 5 feet tall by 1 foot thick, and while it originally served to divide two communities by the color of their skin, by 1971, residents on both sides of the wall were now predominantly black. After years of resentment over the Burwood Wall, in 2006, community activists and Detroit residents came together to flip the wall from a symbol of hatred to an act of healing, allowing artists to express themselves in murals, which include such varied depictions as a cappella singers and Rosa Parks' now infamous bus ride. In 2021, the wall was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, establishing the Burwood Wall not only as a reminder and recognition of America's racist past, but also of a new hope for lasting equality, now and into the future. And there you have it, Detroit's Burwood Wall, today on the Daily Dose. Get your nerd on with the Daily Dose. And if you enjoyed today's episode, share the link with a friend or colleague so that they too can learn something new every day.